I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm talking about, does loneliness worsen ADHD? There are 20 years of studies, more than 20, showing that there's a strong association with ADHD contributing to loneliness or associated with children and adults with ADHD feeling lonelier. In recent years, there's been more study on trying to look at whether loneliness contributes to negative outcomes in physical and mental health. Those studies, none of them are specifically looking at, or very few, whether loneliness is contributing to ADHD, but these studies have shown that loneliness is associated with later decreases in cognitive functions, including attention, planning, organization, emotional regulation, and working memory. All of those are ADHD symptoms. So what I'm trying to present today is that while loneliness doesn't create ADHD, it can worsen the severity of ADHD, which means that it will convert some individuals who are subsyndromal or have milder versions of ADHD into full-blown ADHD. And this means that we have a feedback loop, that ADHD creates loneliness, and loneliness contributes to more ADHD-like behavior, which then again can contribute to loneliness. The first thing is to make an important distinction between social isolation, just how many connections a person has, how much time they're spending with those connections. So social isolation is being alone. Some people are actually pretty happy being alone. So loneliness is different in that loneliness is a subjective feeling. You have less social connection than you want. There are people who seem to be socially active, connected, who feel lonely. So you can have social isolation without feeling lonely. You can have loneliness with a parent, social connectedness. I mean, again, usually there is some correlation, but they are distinct and separate variables. Problems with the studies in this area is that when we're talking about loneliness, we have fairly sophisticated, although imperfect, ways of measuring ADHD rating scales. And there's ways, again, to quantitatively measure social isolation on a variety of variables or dimensions in terms of strength of connections, frequency of connections, number of connections. Loneliness is usually assessed by one or most two or three questions. Do you feel lonely? And almost every study that I've seen makes it a categorical answer. So you are, yes, you're lonely, or no, you're not lonely. Clearly, loneliness exists on a spectrum. So by arbitrarily having it as a discrete yes, no binary variable, we're already degrading the information we could be getting from studying it. And big issue is that many of these studies are just looking at a certain point of time, associating a trait such as ADHD with loneliness. And if they're associated at the same time, that just tells you they run together, doesn't tell you anything about causality. Some of the more informative studies are longitudinal. So that means they look at either ADHD or loneliness at a certain point of time, and then they look at a subsequent time to see if loneliness at point A is associated with point B. That does not prove causality, but that gives you a better handle. There can be reverse causality, there can be other issues, but usually the longitudinal studies give us a little more information as what's contributing to what. Why are we spending so much time these days talking about loneliness? Other than that, in numerous studies, and the current Surgeon General released a report a little more than a year ago, I believe, calling attention to loneliness as a major public health issue, that the impacts of loneliness on heart attacks, strokes, death from all sorts of conditions, mental health issues. Loneliness has a bigger impact than smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, being moderately overweight, moderate hypertension. And some of this is speculative. Some of it's based on sociology and biology, but humans are clearly social animals. Being part of the pack, being protected by the herd, your family, your group, your tribe, was vitally important. People who are alone are not very likely to make it too long. So being connected to your group is vitally important. And loneliness is the pain of being disconnected from your group or other people. And although for decades we thought that the poets talking about the pain of loneliness was sort of a metaphor, what we've learned through neuroscience studies in the last several decades is that many of the same, it's not completely one-to-one perfect overlap, but many of the same pain centers that light up in response to physical pain. You burn your hand, you stub your toe, you rupture a disc in your back, areas of the brain associated with pain activate, light up. With loneliness and other forms of emotional pain, many of those same similar pain centers also are activated. So it's not just a metaphor. It seems to be there to say, this is important and do something about it. So if your hand is on the hot stove or sticking in the fire and it's hurting, get your hand out of there. Ruptured disc is causing pain. Don't do those movements again. Take some rest. Take care of it. If you're lonely, do something to resolve that. Find ways to reconnect, reassociate, rebuild friendships. So there's a fair amount of research over the last few decades that untreated loneliness, uncorrected loneliness leads to greater hypervigilance about social interaction. So you're more worried about being injured or rejected again. So social anxiety is connected with it, or more sensitive to slights, and your whole sympathetic nervous system is keyed up. Your cortisol is greater flowing level. Connection between ADHD and loneliness has been most studied in children, as with many other aspects of ADHD. And it's not absolutely every study. There's a few outliers, fairly overwhelming majority of studies that have looked at loneliness in children with ADHD, found children with ADHD rate themselves as feeling more lonely than their non-ADHD peers. Many people have posited, well, that's just because depression is associated with ADHD. But the relationship between loneliness and ADHD exists even when you subtract or control for depression. Other comorbid mental health issues do seem to account for some of the association, but it's a small part of the association. Studied and theorized about this suggests that there's several reasons children with ADHD are more likely to be lonely. So on objective measures, people with ADHD, children and adults, are more likely to have difficulties in relationships. They're more likely to have poorer quality relationships. They're more likely in adulthood to be single. They're more likely to be divorced. This is a little bit in contrast to one of my other talks where we talked about sex and ADHD, where actually those with ADHD in most studies are actually likely to be sexually active at earlier ages, more partners, more risky behaviors. But with relationship, there's a lag. People with ADHD are often perceived as being different. In much of our society, differentness is scorned, pushed away, stigmatized, perceived as being different, and they're being criticized for being different, told they did something wrong or stupid or off. In one situation, they may worry, am I going to do it again? Particularly given with ADHD, they may not even have been paying attention and know what they did that was so wrong or bad. People with ADHD have a tendency to miss social cues, and interestingly, some of the studies differentiate autism spectrum disorders from ADHD. This is an overgeneralization and oversimplification. You certainly can have both going on at the same time. But with ASD, it's more that the person really doesn't get, understand, comprehend social cues. With ADHD is if you ask them, what does this face look like? What's this behavior mean? They understand, they know, they just weren't paying attention and attending to it. So that can lead to social problems and disruption and eventually loneliness. Other aspects of ADHD is a tendency to invade others' personal space. So literally stepping on people's toes, cutting in line, physically as well as verbally, blurting things out, and often things that other people would be more discreet and not mention. Many people with ADHD sort of value that I'm the truth teller, and what they're saying may well be true, but in polite society, most other people wouldn't have said that. So the person who was the recipient of that feels hurt or insulted and doesn't want to be your friend. Other ways ADHD can contribute to social isolation is hyperfocus. So when we're so absorbed in a task, everyone else leaves to go to lunch as a group, and you aren't intentionally brushing them off or thinking you're too good to go out with them. You're just so absorbed in your work, you weren't even aware of what was going on. Hyperactivity of ADHD can also cause social problems. So if you're fidgeting all the time, you've seen it in classrooms and others where the person with ADHD may be hypersensitive or complaining about other people making noise, and they're completely unaware of when they themselves are making distracting sounds or movements. People with ADHD are overrepresented among those who have gaming addictions or problematic internet use. Both of those are also independently associated with higher rates of loneliness, and particularly gaming addiction, at least in one study, seemed to be more problematic than just problematic internet use. There's also been a number of studies in the last very few years about how loneliness during the COVID epidemic was particularly harsh or likely to affect or increase loneliness among those with ADHD. Far and away, the two biggest angles that are being examined are how loneliness contributes to depression and looking at how loneliness may contribute or be a risk factor for dementia in the elderly. What I'm sort of extracting from much of that work is that much of what they're looking at when they look at specific symptoms is, again, that loneliness is associated with poor emotional regulation. That's a symptom of ADHD. It's associated with poor impulse control. That's a symptom of ADHD. It's associated with poor short-term memory. That's associated with ADHD. It's associated with poor planning and organization. At least one study that tried to do a factor analysis and pull them apart, the strongest association of among these different executive function categories was between loneliness and planning and working memory. These are associations, and even in the longitudinal studies, these are looking at loneliness at one point in time. They can't rule out reverse causality. So, for example, dementia, Alzheimer's dementia, at least we know, is happening for 20, 25, 30 years in many people before observable memory apathy symptoms. But maybe these people are actually suffering aspects of their dementia earlier, and part of that could well be social isolation and loneliness. It's hard to conclusively say that loneliness is causing these things, but there's a strong association, and that there's neuroanatomic evidence that there's stronger connectivity in default mode network. Depression itself is associated with a overly strongly wired default mode network. The default mode network is what you're doing when you're ruminating, thinking about yourself, thinking about your life, sort of me-centered problems rather than interacting with the world. Neuroanatomic evidence that loneliness is associated with greater wiring, strengthening within the default mode network, and poorer wiring to attentive networks. Whether this is just because someone who's lonely is interacting less with the world, they're getting less stimulation, and that's changing their wiring, or whether it's because loneliness is a toxic, stressful condition and you may have greater cortisol, or whether it's because loneliness leads itself to rumination and you may be strengthening the default mode network just by practicing that. So what can we do about this? So often when I say, again, I think pretty clearly we have evidence of a feedback loop. The more ADHD symptoms you have, the more likely you are to be lonely. The more lonely you are, the more likely you are to worsen ADHD symptoms. So some people hear feedback loop and think, oh my God, that means I can't ever get out of it. It's always reinforcing itself. If you have a feedback loop, anywhere you break it, it's broken. So you can choose to work on any piece of it. Stimulant medications, to the extent that they reduce ADHD symptomatology, should, according to some of the studies, again, this has not been directly tested, SSRIs or buspirone are specifically effective for reducing loneliness. Probably they're effective for a social anxiety component that can be secondary to loneliness and can be part of what perpetuates loneliness. So medication may be a helpful way for breaking part of that loop, but more of the work is probably going to be involved in cognitive behavioral therapy, reframing fears about, how likely is it that you're really being rejected? What does that mean? What's the severity of that? Does that mean just because someone said something critical or said something at one point, they really want to have nothing to do with you? Social skills training can be helpful in people learn how to connect better. People with ADHD, particularly training them to attend to social cues. Again, they usually can figure out what they mean if they see them. Some of the things I usually encourage people with ADHD and who've had trouble in social situations is, to the extent that they're comfortable, being both proactive and reparative. If you're in a workplace situation and people have already noticed that you are late for meetings, if you blurt things out, if you're not as well organized before the meetings, it can be helpful to talk ahead of time about your ADHD and whether they're bosses, co-workers at the same level, or underlings. It can also be helpful to say, I have ADHD. If you hear me going off track at a meeting, say this to help rein me in. The reparative component is apologizing afterwards. People are often afraid of apologizing. If you did something later and you think it was wrong or inappropriate, it usually makes sense to say, sorry, I did this. I wasn't intending to cut you off. So that's about all I'm going to say with loneliness and ADHD. I believe it's a feedback loop, but it's one that can be addressed. It's important to address because, again, of the other health implications of being lonely too long. And if you are happy being solitary and relatively isolated, great. Works for you. Don't worry. Stay healthy, stay happy, and have a good week.